Right, so good evening everyone and welcome to the fourth webinar in Hope Farm's technical webinar series set to celebrate Hope Farm's 20th birthday. Since October, in these challenging times, we've been joined by farmers, conservationists, scientists, and of course those that tick all of these above three categories. We have learned about habitat provision, soil health and biodiversity and ecological intensification, and now insecticide-free farming. It is fantastic this evening to welcome 200 people who've been registered from across the country and beyond. So hello to those reaching us from Edinburgh, from the Alpine region of France, and we have, I think, our most distant registrar to date from the USA. A few housekeeping points from us. The session is being recorded and will be available to view after the webinar on the Farm Wildlife YouTube page. As this webinar, your video has been disabled as well as your audio. However, you still have full use of the Q&A box to put any of your questions in. You will find the Q&A box at the bottom of your screens, so please post any questions you have throughout the presentations, and these will be monitored by my colleagues Sophie and Rebecca. We will then answer these questions once all presentations are finished when we come to the Q&A session at the end. Please note that depending on time, we may not be able to get through all of the questions, in which case we will be looking to get these back to you in an event response after this evening. So for the benefit of the whole audience, I'll very briefly summarise what insecticides are. These are pesticides, as the name would suggest, that are designed to protect planted crops from insecticide damage, either directly or by spreading disease. These can be natural or synthetic and vary both in persistence and potential to harm other organisms in the environment. At the RSPB, our interest sits with insecticides due to this potential to harm the environment and a need to find more sustainable alternatives in many cases. It seems a long time ago since the disasters of DDT and the impact on wildlife right up to birds of prey and the resulting population collapse of these species. However, we are still finding out more and more each year regarding the potential harm agricultural chemicals may pose on the environment. A well-balanced ecosystem has its own mechanism for protecting plants from pests and disease. Promoting a more balanced ecosystem on farmlands can only be for the better. We won't be discussing any other pesticides such as herbicides or fungicides per se, although these are still pesticides that we are working to reduce the use of long-term at Hope Farm as well. So bringing it down to Hope Farm, we are 180 hectares sitting in the south of Cambridgeshire, having owned, well, as the name would suggest, for 20 years now by the RSPB. We farm 7 different crops, including wheat, spring and winter barley, beans, some oilseed rape, oats and millet, and growing cover crops as well. Since purchasing the farm, our approach to wildlife-friendly farming has changed a great deal. 20 years ago, that meant providing habitats in marginal areas whilst maintaining relatively intensive production within the cropped area. This still yielded massive benefits for biodiversity. We then worked to improve the cropped area itself for wildlife, diversifying the rotation more, improving the soil management and reducing pesticide use, and farming without insecticides since 2018. Since removing insecticides from the system, pests have not caused any greater issues in the crop than they had before. Bean crops have been booming with beneficial insects all through the summer, including hoverfly and ladybird larvae that do an excellent job of mopping up black bean aphid pests. In my time managing the farm since 2018, walking through the beans in the summer still remains a clear memory of mine. Just seeing the sheer numbers of ladybird larvae working their way through the black bean aphid populations was incredible and costed nothing. Without any treatments, our beans yielded pretty well at 4.5 tonnes a hectare and a reasonable £400 a hectare profit after accounting for the contracting costs. This, of course, it may go without saying, but this was accompanied by the provision of habitats around the edge, so wildflower margins and hedgerows that provided extra resources to help boost these beneficial populations. Our oilseed rape has grown away from potential cabbage stem flea beetle damage, but only where our soils have been in better condition. And it's worth considering complications in establishment seasons of climate change too. Our cereal crops have seen no reduction in yields. It's really hard to identify changes from one single farm and what these are because of, but the removal of insecticides may be contributing to the massive boom in butterfly numbers that we've seen in recent years at the farm. We've monitored birds, butterflies and bees for many years now, and our butterfly numbers have increased at an incredible rate since we bought the place, largely due to the provision of flowering habitats. But this rate of increase has grown dramatically since 2018, and our butterfly index now sits at an amazing 409% higher than it did when we first purchased the farm. It is hard to unpick the relationships between insecticide use and biodiversity on a farm alone, though the combination of habitat provision and sympathetic in-field management have worked amazingly at boosting the numbers of butterflies and which are good indicators of other insect species as well. When we set the programme for this webinar, we set out to discuss lessons learned at Hope Farm, Martin Lyons' farm and the National Trust's organic farm at Wimpole with Callum Weir, farm manager. Here, with about a decade of collective experience in farming combinable crops without insecticides, we hope to share experiences with cereals, beans and oilseed rape, as is typical of this area in East Anglia, along with a few other crops and methods around the edge as well. It is great pleasure now to be able to also introduce Tom Clarke to the room, providing an expertise from a sugar beet perspective on a few other crops and trials on insect control that may help to move away from relying on pesticides harmful to the environment in the future. We will later also be joined by Steph Moren, Senior Policy Officer at the RSPB with a focus on pesticides. Very much looking forward to her policy perspective. Today, I hope we'll be able to provide a diverse range of experiences to see how insecticide-free farming may work for other farmers across the UK. Although pockets of change are helpful, it's not so useful or is no good really, hoping to reverse declines in biodiversity just from changing a few isolated pockets of a few hundred hectares each across the country. We really need to replicate these changes on a much wider scale to make a difference. So with that, I'll introduce our first speaker. Martin Lyons is UK Chair of the Nature Friendly Farming Network and contractor at Hope Farm for the environmental habitat and cropping. At Hope Farm, we work on a shared farm agreement, and many of the methods that we wish to put in place are made possible with his practical experiences. He has farmed insecticide-free across his own farm for nearly 6 years now and farms around 1,000 hectares in total, including other contracted farms. I look forward to hearing from Martin and how he makes insecticide-free farming possible on his patch and his perspectives as well in how he can make this kind of system, or how we can make this kind of system work on a much wider scale. So with no further ado, I will pass it over to you, Martin.
And thank you very much, Georgie, and good evening. I'll just share my screen to you. There's play. And you should have that. Can you just confirm?
Yeah, that's good to go.
Right, so it's, for me, insecticide-free farming and working with nature to deliver the solutions we need. So I'm an arable farmer, 3rd generation. We grow combinable crops of wheat, barley, oilseed, rape, beans, and I'm going down a regenerative farming system now, doing no cultivations and with cover crops. So just over 20 odd years ago, when I was coming back into the business after being to university and college, our farm was a typical arable farm at those times. We ended up at the end of harvest, mowing all our grass verges, all the ditches, trimming all the hedges up. We entered into a countryside stewardship scheme, which is a 10-year government funded, where we put some grass margins around the outside of the fields, and pictures on the left, and put about 4.5 kilometres of new hedgerow in. And that was just to stop my products I was using getting near watercourses. But while I was in that scheme, my eyes really started to open about the biodiversity and the habitats we deliver on our farms. And the pictures on your right-hand side, after that scheme finished, we entered into a ELS, an entry level, and a higher level stewardship scheme. So the focus was really to make the farm, business, and the landscape more productive for my cropping and my farming, but also for biodiversity. And you'll see that many of the splits in between the fields have got wider and greener edges. So we straightened the fields off, made the corridors wider, so we get the opportunity to deliver different habitat across the farm that allowed us to farm in a more nature-friendly way. So in those bits we took out of production from our normal cropping, we delivered birdseed mixes, because that was my target species when I entered the scheme, which had lots of flowering elements in as well. So we supported them. But the really exciting part that I discovered as we went into this, and this is all government funded delivery, that we delivered a flowering corridor that we put in place from one side of the farm across and now into the rented land we do the other side, connecting our habitat and our landscape together. Some of it was just 6-metre margins, flower enhanced. Others were really wide strips where we straightened off the edges. And rapidly we noticed the increase in insect life within these margins, the increased bird life that came and ate those insects. In the second year, the field in the top left picture, in the top left window, we had a crop of winter beans in there. It grew really well, full of pollinators when we had it in flower. And then when it went into pod, the black bean aphids came in and they got really thick, high numbers. So my agronomist, who recommends the chemistry and the chemicals to use to protect my crop, said, I need to use an insecticide. When the product turned up the following day, so did the wind and the rain for 10 days. So at the end of that weather period, when we got a chance to spray again, I went to look at the crop before I mixed the chemical. And what, to my astonishment, instead of seeing the crop almost dead, we saw the aphids on the beans being eaten by lacewings and ladybirds and other bits. So I chose not to spray. And actually we saw no crop loss by doing that. So it really made me focus around, how do I work with these beneficiaries? How do I have a landscape really delivering the life cycle for all the beneficiaries that can help me grow my crops with less inputs? So it's all about delivering those habitats all year round for the life cycle of the birds, the bees, the pollinators, the predatory insects across the landscape. And it's really important to have that management right. So those grassy areas, those uncut hedges, those flowery strips, not just on the outside of the field, but as you see in the bottom left-hand picture, across the field. The more I understand working at Hope Farm and reading some data and science paper around the habitat we need to deliver, it's no good just having it on the outside. We need to spread it across the middle of the fields. So this is just a short video showing you what it looks like across the field. I talk in this video a lot about pollinators, but the predatory insects is the same principle, but you'll just get to see what I mean.
Spring beans coming into flower, absolutely buzzing the bees. Really helped by delivering these really rich pollen and nectar margins with a diverse flower mix in them. There's loads of different things right in the bottom. So we encourage the pollinators and insects to be here through the late spring and summer, because these are always delivering. And then when we've got a crop on that needs pollination, they haven't got far to go because we've encouraged them here to go out into the field and do their work out there. And we've seen yield increases sometimes between 5 and even 20% through the yield monitor beside these margins. So the more margins we can have when we have pollinating crops, the better. And it's a great resource to encourage pollinators across our landscape to increase their numbers, but also increase the pollination in our spring beans. For spring beans, it's not just important about to have these margins around the outside, it's where we can add them within the tramline widths in the middle of the fields. So we add the pollination, the biodiversity right across the field landscape. Absolutely buzzing with insects, all travelling out, helping to pollinate my crops. But also in the cereal crops, we have more predators of beetles and bugs to help our cereal crops. Yeah. absolutely lovely.
And that's enough of that. So as you see, it's about adding that diversity to within our landscape. For me, we need to work with nature-based integrated pest management and think about how we have the habitat and the landscape fit first, and then look at products to add on top. And this video is just, it's a bit shaky, but you'll get to an idea of just the biodiversity and the insect and creepy crawly life that we have within this is a grass margin.
This one, just driven through some grass. How many creepy crawlies, insects do we have living in there? The floor is just alive. Just how much we have in our glass script. All these feed chicks and various other things.
So as you can see, it's that biodiversity. I was a farmer years ago that looked to kill the pests. Now I want to see aphids in my landscape all year round to feed the predators. And we need to not just wait for the aphids to come and then look for the predatory insects. We need that life cycle going on all year round. So when those aphids numbers increase, the predators are already there working alongside. And sometimes we have to be a little patient because it takes 7 to 10 days for the predators numbers to catch up to the aphids. But we just need to be a little patient. So for me, the answer is no longer now just in the bottle and the can or the product I use. It's the system we deliver and the habitat and the landscape we work to make my business more viable. But it means I use less products and I work hopefully in the nature-based solutions. So the two top pictures there is the oilseed rape in a young tender stage. Years ago, we used to have a product, a seed treatment, was a neonicotinoid, which got banned, and in my belief, rightly so, for the habitat and the damage it's done to water courses, to our soil and the bees. That actually made my crop of rape more of a challenge to grow. But what we are seeing is with the weather change patterns, the autumn becoming really dry, which is stressing the crop, which is allowing the pests to take hold. In the bottom two pictures, you'll see what I mean by the rape was struggling, but you see two green areas. These were areas that were left out, but that were put into a skylark plot the previous season in our winter wheat, so they weren't cropped. But the soil become healthier. And just look at the difference. Where we have healthier soil, the crops are managing to resist the pest problem. So we need to work with our soils and get the beneficial, get the benefit and habitat right in our soils, and getting that health of our soils right and our rotations to really deliver the difference. We so often as farmers blame a product being removed for the problems it causes us, when actually many of the problems are within our landscape and under our feet. And for me, that's how we need to farm in the future. And I encourage other farmers to think in that way. So there's lots of great organisations already out there that give you lots of great advice. There's a farm wildlife website. There'll be the Nature Friendly Farming next website that gives you lots of case studies of different farmers doing different ways. And for me, my eyes really opened when I work with and engage with conservation organisations, particularly Bug Life, the RSPBs and many others. They have some really great resource. I may not always agree with some of their messaging, but actually they can really help me understand what I need to deliver. In agriculture at college, I learned about production of crops and animal health, but now I need to learn about biodiversity and insects. And there's some great resources on the agroecology website. And for me, it's about working together with other farmers, how we learn new practices and deliver a better farming system. So that's my last slide. So thank you very much. And I really look forward to the questions later.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Martin, for that. And really interesting presentation, just picking out a few things from that. It's really interesting to see the journey Martin made to insecticide-free farming, the different species as well in those margins that will suit different insect species. Just the diversity is really critical to providing these services that we need. Those videos provide a fantastic argument to show how amazing farmland can be for biodiversity and just harnessing that sort of power to help grow the crops. And looking at that oilseed rape there, it highlights a big issue that we've come across at Hope Farmers are these dry autumns and lack of moisture in the soil can make it much harder to grow strong crops that are able to overcome pests. But there are solutions to that. We need to improve the crop vigor and create a system of change so we can avoid the can as the only solution to growing a successful crop. I'm now going to move on to introduce two farmers from East Anglia, pioneering in wildlife friendly farming and providing a few different perspectives on the challenges and successes on insecticide free farming. So Callum Weir, before recently or very recently leaving for a new role, has managed the National Trust's Wimpole estate for 3.5 years. Wimpole is 2,500 acre estate in South Cambridgeshire, where the National Trust manages 1,500 acres of the farm in hand. 1,000 acres of that is an organic arable enterprise. Organic farming relies on producing crops and livestock without artificial inputs like fertilizers and pesticides. So Callum will explain the methods he's used and the challenges he's faced during his time managing the farm without insecticides. We'll then move on to introducing Tom, or I'll introduce Tom Clarke now, who'll talk about his background and farm after Callum. Tom farms just over 1,000 acres of fenland near Ely in Cambridgeshire, farming milling wheat, sugar beet, potatoes and linseed. Tom sits on the NFU Sugar Board since 2018, was chosen as an emerging leader at the Oxford Farming Conference in 2019, and also sits on the NFU's 2040 Net Zero Steering Group. He is, of course, also part of the 22 farmers that form the Ely Nature Friendly Farming Zone, seeking to inform the public about the great things that they are doing for nature as well as food production. So I think without ado, if I can hand over to you two. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Georgie. I think it's me first. Hi, everyone. I'm Callum. I used to manage the National Trust Wimpole estate, as Georgie said, and it's an organic farm. And that means that we have to look at using farming methods that avoid the use of insecticides. We don't have the choice of using them. Organic farming is a legally defined way of farming, so that we rely on different methodologies to produce profitable crops. And so just to talk about the rotation, I guess to start, is that we rely heavily on a diverse rotation. Organic farming requires nutrients to be added to the soil via crops such as clover, other legumes, as well as using livestock in that integrated approach to add nutrition to the soil. And following that, then we tended at Wimpole to have 3 cereal crops. It tended to be a winter wheat, then a winter oat crop, and then spring barley. But we did also try other things such as rye and peas. And amongst that sort of diverse rotation, we also had a significant HLS agreement, something similar to what Martin discussed. So across our 1,000 acres of arable, we had 60 hectares worth of margins, we had 35 kilometres of hedges, and we had another 30 hectares of habitat for wildlife. Overall, about 15% of the farm was out of production and for wildlife. And what I wanted to highlight within that is that the system was based on diversification, and we were diversifying our rotation by farming different things: livestock, crops, cereals, pulses, grass. And we're also diversifying our business by adding a premium for organic food. So generally our crops commanded a higher price, twice the price of conventional crops. And then within our business and within our landscape, we were diversifying by adding another income stream, which was the stewardship agreement, but also diversifying the habitats that were available on the farm. And I think through that diversity, we created a really resilient system, and that resilience helped in our business, but also helped in supporting the habitats required for us to maintain a system that didn't need insecticides. It's not to say that we didn't have our challenges with pests, but overall the system leveled itself out. We had winners and we had losers. And what do we do specifically within that? What techniques as organic farmers did we input to replace insecticides? Well, firstly, as I talked about, we had a diverse rotation, and a rotation is important when we're talking about insecticides specifically, is to prevent the build-up of certain residues and certain pests in the fields, in the soils, and the rotation broke that life cycle of pests that would potentially harm our crops. We also use cultivation. It's something that some people don't use, but within organic farming, it's something that you sort of need to use. The industry is working to reduce its cultivations, and we certainly did. But cultivations were a tool that we used to help minimize the impact pests had on our crops. We use cultivations to bury trash. We use cultivations to protect our crops from pests such as wireworm. We also were really conscious about the varieties of crops we choose. For example, a pest that can be a problem is orange wheat blossom midge, and we chose varieties of crops that prevented us. They're resistant to that specific pest. So across these things, we're looking at crop selection, we're looking at crop health, we're looking at all the things that are in our arsenal that all helped diversify our farming system. And I did say that we had some challenges. We did have orange wheat blossom midge in 2018, which meant that we lost some yield and prompted a change in variety choice. We did lose a field of winter wheat to wireworm, and that needed more cultivation and replanting in the spring. And slugs are a challenge that we faced. But by using those methods, we tried to minimize the impact that the pests had. And as I said, we had a diverse system where when we had those losers, we also had winners elsewhere on the farm. And what were the impacts, I guess, of our farming system? Well, our farming system, we had a 38% increase in invertebrate species between 2003 and 2019. And within that, there's a 150% increase in the number of species of wasps, bees, and ants, the family combined. We had 49 species of wasps on the farm, 75 species of bee, 46 species of hoverfly, and 22 species of butterflies. And all those things combined show that we had a really healthy ecosystem, and things like the wasps in particular were great predators of the aphids that were some of the damage. But we also had a profitable farm. The farm across the 1,000 acres, including the subsidy, made £120,000 a year. And we produced food. Our wheat yielded 5 tons a hectare, as well as our oats. Our peas, we didn't do so well. We yielded 1 ton a hectare. So I guess what I'm trying to say is that through organic farming, there's a variety of different methods that we have employed that help our farming systems as a whole. They help soil health, they help sequester carbon, they promote birds, they minimize the need for artificial inputs, and they maintain a livelihood. And that's really crucial, that we need to help farmers maintain livelihoods. And that was a key part of what we did. So I've talked enough now, but hopefully I've demonstrated that it can be profitable. We made money on our crops, and we also supported public access. We supported carbon sequestration, and we supported nature-friendly farming. So it is possible. And yeah, it's not just because we're organic, but it's because of the ethos. And I think the next speaker, Tom, has a very similar ethos in a different farming system.
Thank you, Callum. I guess I'm up. So I think the first thing I should say is I'm not an organic farmer. I do use pesticides on my farm, largely fungicides, but also some herbicides, and I have used insecticides. But I do know that isn't the future. And where I have used pesticides, it has been through gritted teeth. And my agronomist has often written recommendations for me to use insecticides, which I have very politely ignored. And the consequences haven't been disastrous. So I think there is probably too much reflex, as Martin alluded to, there's too much reflex use of insecticides. And IPM is integrated pest management, and it's what everyone talks about. But in essence, it's about using pesticides as a last resort only after you've tried everything else. So all the cultural controls that we can learn a lot from the organic farmers and from nature-friendly farming as well. But sometimes you hit a problem and there is nothing else left to do. And that's been the situation where I have been using insecticides. Now, Sugar Beet has been in the news recently. You may well have seen that the government have granted a emergency authorization for temporary and very restricted use of neonicotinoid seed treatment in sugar beet. And I guess the question is, why do I think that is justified in this case? And it really comes down to the fact there's no alternative. And that really isn't a good enough answer. So this last year, I've been trying to find alternatives. The problem with sugar beet is that it's not so much the insects. The aphids aren't really the problem. It's the disease they carry and transmit to the plant. They only have to bite the plants once to transmit the disease. So with other crops, which like beans and stuff, if you've got insects which are feeding off the plants, you've got that 7 to 10 days that Martin was talking about for the natural predators to ramp up their activity and take control of the pests. But for example, with this virus yellows, and I think also with barley dwarf yellow virus in cereals, you can't leave that time. You're going to get the disease in the crop from just having the insects there for that 7 to 10 days before nature can step up. So I need alternatives that aren't pesticides, and at the moment they're very thin on the ground. So what have I been trying to do? This last spring I tried a new approach. In glass houses, it's been quite common for insects, predatory insects, parasitoizing insects to be introduced under glass and under cover for fruit crops and things like that to increase the levels of those insects in that environment to control pests. Hasn't really been used, hasn't really been seen practical as an alternative in open fields. But I tried it. So I got in touch with a company that produces these for glass houses, and we introduced hundreds of thousands of lacewing larvae to a field of sugar beet last spring. And it was a controlled trial to see how many we'd have to use, and against a field where we had used the insecticides, and to compare how the effects panned out. The first thing we noticed was just by not spraying on the field before we introduced the predatory insects, we had a much larger population of ladybirds and other natural predators in the field we hadn't sprayed. As I said, so it shows the potential there, but as I said, it's a problem because of the lag, and so we did have virus in the field, and that's one of the things we've learned. This is what trials are for. And the problem was that the aphids came in very early last year, before the natural predators and the temperatures allowed them to breed, before they had the food sources to breed. And so that's why we're trying a new approach this year. And it's taking a step back. And these insects are bred up in these factories for glass houses, and they feed them on moth eggs, which they also breed up, which are then sterilized, and that's a food source. So for this year, for this approach, we are trying a way of introducing that food source, the sterilized moth eggs, and broadcasting them into a field to provide a food source, not just for any insects we might introduce, but also the natural predators that are already in the field. I am in HLS, and we have, we're lucky to have good floristically enhanced grass margins and beetle banks, pollen and nectar plots. So we have, by working with nature, we have got a base population already there. If we feed that, and then also we introduce extra predators into the crop, we're hoping we can build up the predator numbers before the influx of the aphids to prevent that disease transmission. We're also trying other things like cover crops. Apparently, there's some evidence that using barley and sugar beet, for example, can disguise the crop and camouflage it from the aphids, which fly in great migratory waves. So it's given you a little flavor of some of the techniques I've tried. The key is we can stop using insecticides, but we do need alternatives. And that's where I'm focusing my effort, is trying to find those alternatives. In the future, in the long term, as Callum alluded to, the breeders can come up with new varieties of crops which are naturally resistant, but it doesn't happen on a sixpence. There is a lead up time, and sometimes you need something to bridge the gap. So that's what we're looking for.
Brilliant. Thank you both, Tom and Callum, for your perspectives on the farms that you manage or have managed. I think it is really important, just from what you've both said, to recognise that nature-friendly farming, organic farming, it comes at a premium. Organic's a good example of that and how that system has worked. But things like insecticide-free farming and that kind of approach, that it needs the support from the public for this to work. Tom has demonstrated as well that going insecticide free is very complicated in some crops. Although it's something that we can all agree in the room we should aim to do, removing insecticides as a whole. It's worth noting here before we start the discussion that the RSPB are against the neonicotinoid emergency derogation. Because of the implications of harm not just to bees and bee populations, but aquatic life, mammals and birds, that we don't feel is acceptable enough to approve the derogation, as the evidence hasn't changed. But that's why we've got a diversity of views in the room so that we can have these discussions. However, it's also amazing to see these things that Tom is undertaking as a real pioneering farmer, I'd say, to try and find alternatives that really are innovative. It really shows that we need to provide more support so that we can refine these systems and look to nature as the solution for controlling pest species and improve our security in growing crops long term. So I think with further ado, we're going to move on to the Q&A now. I will also introduce Steph Moren, who has worked at the RSPB for 12 years. Hi, Steph. In a variety of different roles, including 6 years in the species recovery team, working on a number of different threatened species, including the turtle dove and swifts. For the last 2 years, she has worked in the Land and Seas and Climate Policy team with a specific focus on pesticide policy. I also realise I haven't introduced myself, which is a bit of an error on my part, so apologies. I am the Hope Farms farm manager and have been at Hope Farm since 2017 and farm manager since the autumn of 2018. Prior to that, I have grown up on an arable farm of 300 acres. That is, I'm now third generation farmer and have studied and gave my master's in zoology at the University of Nottingham. So I think without further ado, if I could welcome everybody back into the room, including Sophie Mott, who has been kindly keeping an eye on your questions with Becca, and get the sessions going.
Absolutely. So we've got lots of really good questions coming in. So the first one I'm going to pop out there is, the RSPB is concerned primarily with birds, many of which depend on insects. How are you going to combine your wildlife aims with climate change objectives? Not very impressed by the carbon storage in the hedge of the photo behind you, Martin.
Shall I let Martin defend that first, then we'll move on to the next part of the question, or shall I give you time to think about that one?
I'll defend that first. It's not a hedge. It's weeds that are growing up. There's no hedge along there. There's actually a ditch there, and there's a buffer zone of flowers to protect the ditch. So it's just a load of weeds. I can't remember the varieties. I'm sure Georgie will tell me what they were. That's not a hedge.
There we go. I can't see from the picture here exactly what they are, but that's that question dealt with. And then, so you're going to have to remind me on the next part of the question, Sophie.
Yeah, no worries. So how are you going to combine your wildlife aims with climate change objectives?
Right. So Steph, I think with your part in the policy, then it'd be great so we can give a perspective on what our aims are at Hope Farm as well?
Sure. So I'll think that my fellow panelists are probably better placed to answer on specific in-farm measures, but I think the question was around how you balance the, protecting wildlife, which is obviously a key part of the RSPB's aim, with tackling climate change as well. So I can give my perspective on that. So I think obviously there's two crises going on at the moment. There's the biodiversity and nature crises and the climate crisis. We obviously need to tackle both. They are different but incredibly interrelated as well, both in terms of the challenges and in terms of the solutions. So obviously climate change is one of the biggest threats to the planet's health, including to nature. And so it is absolutely vital that we tackle it. RSPB recently did a piece of work mapping across the UK, mapping areas that were the most nature rich and the areas that were most carbon rich, and overlaying those maps. And not particularly surprisingly, but very usefully, there was a huge overlap. And so one of the most important things to do is to protect and restore those areas, because that's a kind of win-win situation. And, large parts of that area is things like peatlands. And so, protecting and restoring those areas are what we call nature-based solutions to climate change. Peatlands isn't the only one. There's all sorts of other ones, including obviously forests and wetlands, etc. And so focusing on those and talking about nature-based solutions as this kind of win-win is really sort of the RSPB's key message on this. And we hope that that message will come across when the UK government hosts the next climate conference at the end of this year as well. Obviously, there are, nature-based solutions can be used on farm as well, both in terms of tackling climate change like agroforestry, but also nature-based solutions to things like pest management are also things that colleagues have talked about already. It is, though, important that any climate solutions that we use don't come at an unacceptable risk to detriment to wildlife. So it is kind of managing those kind of twin things and focusing on the win-wins.
Well, thank you, Steph. Yes, just to provide a bit of a Hope Farm perspective. So we have certainly started, although we ran a carbon audit about 10 years ago on the farm, we have more recently started to focus a lot more on our practices, how they can implicate our carbon footprint and how they can reduce it as well, whilst still keeping that main aim of Hope Farm to farm in a way that works with biodiversity. It does help that a lot of the practices that we do to help store carbon can be really good for biodiversity. So bigger, thicker hedges, I think it's the wider the hedge rather than the taller, it's actually really good for carbon storage, because you have all of that biomass and the roots underground. That's also providing loads of resources for flowering plants that provide good habitats for insects. Wider hedges are so much better for nesting bird species. And then the soil management as well, which we've focused on a lot more in the last 5 years, reducing our reliance on inorganic nitrogen and looking for more organic matter, using cover crops. There's a lot to sequester carbon and store it. Also helps to create that basal food resource of organic matter to feed things like earthworms and other sort of soil invertebrates that provide a really good food source for birds. So there are some things where they might not be so synergistic in what they can do for climate and biodiversity, but there are a lot of win-wins there. And I think it would be great to bring in some of your guys' experiences from your farms as well. Should we go first to Callum and provide an organic perspective there?
Yeah, I think this is really one of those ones where I think a lot of people have just said that it's not looking at it with one lens. There's a looking at it at there's a triple challenge approach, I think, and we need to look at, and that's how do we feed the world sustainably? How do we tackle the climate crisis, and how do we tackle the biodiversity loss? And I think when you look at that lens, you can look at it at a global scale. We've got to be really careful that we don't export our environmental or climate issues elsewhere. We can look at it at a national level and the policies that we create, and everyone has a role to play in speaking to their MPs about really thinking at it at that level. Then at a farm level, you look at a triple challenge approach. You can make money through farming for food. You can make money for farming through the environment, and I'm sure soon there'll be a way of carbon being an enterprise. So yeah, that's I think that's right. That there's so many more win-wins than there are conflicts. That let's focus on the win-wins.
Brilliant. Thank you for that, Callum.
Can I just quickly add, if we don't tackle our nature and climate crisis, us as farmers will not be in business because of increased drought and increased rainfall patterns. I will not be able to produce crops or other things to sell. And we must focus around moving away from fossil fuel-based products. So we have to, as farmers, really dig deep and deliver those solutions.
Brill. Tom, unless you have something else to add to it, we've taken 5 minutes to answer one question.
I would just echo what Stephanie said, which is that some of these challenges come from climate change. So, for example, in Sugar Beet, one of the reasons we've got a problem with the virus this year is because we didn't get as cold a winter as we normally get. And actually, cold, hard winters are what used to keep a lot of the pests in check. So we're going to face in the future more challenges coming from climate change and keeping farming going. And so we need solutions which can address both problems at the same time.
Yeah, no, that is so true. That is so true. Right, I could also comment on that further, but wishing to get through more questions, I will instead ask for another one from you, please, Sophie.
Well, glad I picked that one. Blimey. But we have got lots of questions, guys, so let's keep these ones snappy. So Martin, amazing to see, music to my ears. Do you think there is enough practical advice out there for farmers to implement things on the ground?
Absolutely not. Much of the advice has been about using products in the past, and we need advice and support around how do we use nature-based solutions and move away from the products. And hopefully through this government and through the network and through organisations working together, we can give that new help and support to farmers in demonstrating new ways of doing things.
Brilliant. I have no other things to add to that unless anybody else does in the room. Right, we'll move on to the next question then. Thanks very much, Martin.
Lovely. So, hi Callum, any chance you could advise on how you went about reducing cultivation and what to do with cover crops without using herbicides? Thanks.
Yeah, I can do that. I think that we just the first thing that we did to reduce cultivations was dig a lot more of ourselves, or get a spade out and look at what we needed to do. Ploughing is a bit of a controversial topic in farming, and I think that people plough for 3 reasons. They plough to create a seedbed, they plough to sort of aerate or drain the soil, and they plough to sort of bury weeds. And my focus as an organic farmer is I could do the first 2 using other methods which moved less soil, but I kept the plough only when I needed it to help me control weeds, and the rest of the time I used min till. The min can vary depending on who you are, but basically shallower cultivations is what I try to do. Or yeah, that was my sort of approach on the farm. Cover crops, it's a good question. Organic cover crops is an area we try to explore more. What I try to do there, and Tom and Martin will really add more colour onto cover crops, but looking at cover crop species that could be killed in a frost, buckwheat, berseem clover, or easily killed cover crops like mustard and phacelia were what we used on the farm. Really tended to avoid any cereal based cover crops, which we really struggled to kill. Hopefully that answers the question.
Oh, that's brilliant, thank you. Right, Sophie, next question please.
Yeah, so I'm going to combine 2 questions here, so give me a second to scroll. But the first one is, if we adopt more species rich margins both on field boundaries and in field, how long does it take to build levels of beneficials to the point where confident not to get the insecticide out? And I'm combining that with one that is, what is the rough distance of travel of beneficials and how can we be sure that we're not harbouring pests too? So they're both about beneficials.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Sophie. I might just kick that off with some experiences from that trial that we're running at Hope Farm on providing, well, we're not running it, sorry, we're participating in. It's run by CH and Rothamsted, and it's called Assist. And it's actually looking at how you can provide wildflower margins through the middle of the field as well as around the outside for providing these pollinator services. And the species mix itself was tweaked to provide lots of different resources for beneficial insects. So like hoverflies, they like the really flat planar flower surfaces, and there's lots of different things going on there, including some clovers I think was selected for beneficial insects too. There are some beneficial things like pollinators. They can move quite a wide distance, but then you have the parasitoid wasps. From what I'm told, some of them can only move for up to 12 meters into a crop. So it's really important to get that connectivity across the whole field. On our farm, the flower margins have got better as they've got older, and it's actually taken 2 years to get a really good diverse margin and a lot of investment to get it in there as well. And from there I might pass on to, if we start off with, well, whichever out of the farmers would like to provide some more insight into how they manage the margins and what services they're providing.
I'll add some quick bits. Time frame, 3 to 5 years. The time you've delivered and established the margin, that's probably 3 years down the line. So you need to allow nature to develop, and those predatory insects, they won't be there by just putting an option in for 1 year. You need to have that reservoir building up to build the life cycle up. So I always think in that 3 to 5 year delivery time frame. And a lot of the data I'm reading and researching is about 50 meters is the ideal between margins. And on our farm, we're putting them in at 120 because my machine is a 30 meter machine, and that's 4 widths. So I'm voluntarily putting those margins in place now because all the data says we need those options in the middle of the field to get that biodiversity out there.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that. Callum, Tom, would you like to provide any further insights at all? I'm going to take silence as a no, we're all good.
I could just add,
yeah.
There was a question there about how do you stop the pests being in the margins too.
Oh, yes.
And I would think the point is that you do have the pests in the margin because they're part of the web of life. That means that you've got the predator. If you don't have the pests, you won't have the predators as well. So it's about the balance, really.
Well, that's, even if you were spraying, that's what thresholds are all about. A small level really isn't a problem. Right, Sophie, if we could move on to the next question, please.
Sure. So I'm combining 2 again here, as they're both about the biocontrol that Tom mentioned. So the first one is, trying biocontrol in an open field is very courageous and costly. Would you try it again? And also, were the lacewing larvae that you introduced produced in the UK, and were they a native species or produced from native stock? Do you know?
So yes, I would definitely try it again. We're going to try it again. We're adapting our technique. It wasn't that costly. I asked the company who were providing them to match the cost of what the insecticides would have been on one part of the field, so that it was no more than we would have had to spend on insecticide. And in the second half of that field, they did a recommended program. But as they pointed out, which was a lot more, and it would have cost a lot more, but as they pointed out, if this was going to be more widespread, they would be producing more of them, and the cost of what we were putting on would be a lot lower. So it was kind of where it could be for a similar cost. Farmers, one of the reasons a lot of farmers don't want to use a lot of these inputs is because they are costly. You know, pesticides, the marketing and the development as well as the actual chemicals themselves, they are a huge cost. And if you can get all those services for free, why wouldn't you do that? And then there was a question about the lacewings. Yeah, they're produced in the UK. It's by a company called BioLine, and they are based, I think, in Essex. I wouldn't say Chelmsford, but it might be Colchester. And they have a huge facility there where they actually breed up a lot of these parasitic wasps, lacewings, for use in glass houses. And as I say, it's a new venture to sort of try them in field. I think they are the same lacewings that we have natively. Obviously, they are bred in the facility itself rather than taken from the wild.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point on sort of the scale of economy. And if you're only getting it from one company, then it's going to be a lot more expensive. So we do need that support out there, and so we can have that more wide scale uptake as things become, as we start to figure out how these systems can work. Unless anybody else has any other input from there, then we might move on to the next question.
Lovely. Okay, so we've got 2 questions here about flower margins and infield strips. So the first one is, a lot of the mixes used in the field margins are non-native species. Does the panel think that using native flowers in the margins could boost beneficial predatory insects as well as being better for biodiversity? And also, have you needed to take any steps to avoid weeds spilling out from your margins and infield strips, probably particularly in organic?
Shall I kick off then on the organic point?
Yeah, go for it.
So on the sort of native species point, I think there's an element of both. I think some non-native species can provide massive biodiversity benefits, but I do think there's a good point there around, you know, restoring. We've lost a huge amount of our wildflower meadows in the UK, and I think that you know, the linking the species within those and agroforestry strips and infield strips, it can only be a good thing, both in protecting those species that we've lost and those habitats that we've lost, as well as providing the benefits that we've been discussing on this webinar about you know, their ability to sort of control pests. With controlling, yeah, I mean, we use cultivations, we use mowing at certain times of the year. That's our main approach, is to stop spilling. And with cover crops, as opposed to the margins, we try to stop them seeding. So it's always a tough balance between allowing the pollinator benefit of a cover crop and stopping them seeding. But I see them as different things. The cover crop is primary function is looking at soil health, whereas a margin has a different function.
Brilliant, thanks for that, Callum. Just to provide a bit of an insight from the trial at Hope Farm, there was a lot of diversity of different flowers, and I thought that it would, or prior to that, thought that native is kind of the main thing you should go for all the time. But in that mix we had crimson clover, which is not native, but it was put in there to provide valuable ecosystem services. So I think it's just thinking out what different plants do provide the valuable sources and just refining that a little. At Hope Farm, we haven't actually had any issues of problematic weeds, that is, spilling out into the crop in a non-organic system. In fact, it's much easier to control it in the crop than it is in the margin, because you have a lot more sensitive species there. Would Tom or Martin like to provide any perspectives as well? Because after that, I think we'll have time for one more question.
No, it's covered. Weeds are only a problem if it's a plant somewhere where you don't want them, and usually we can find ways to manage things right.
Brilliant. So Sophie, if we could have this might be the final question from you.
Yeah, sure. I've picked one that hopefully everyone can answer. So could there also be a benefit to try and move more towards smaller scale farming, where more farmers grow a much wider range of crops in a small area with wildlife habitat, instead of having so many arable and vegetable farms that grow large areas of just one or a few crops? Perhaps also working with supermarkets to promote seasonal nature-friendly farms and organic produce.
Brilliant. Thanks for that, Sophie. And I think it would be really good to kick that off with a policy perspective from Steph.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a really good question. Yes, probably. Obviously, having really large areas of single crop, lack of hedgerows, really large fields, etc. It's well documented that that for many decades has led to a decline in biodiversity, farm and wildlife, farm and birds. And so, yes, the more different habitats and crop rotations and variety of mosaic of habitats that we have across the countryside, then the better for wildlife. From a policy perspective, we are working really closely with DEFRA on the new public money for public goods element of the new land management schemes. And I think, supporting farmers to use all of these techniques and help them to transition rather than suddenly, enforcing things on them, I think is going to be really, really important. Farmers have farmed a certain way based on, the subsidies that they've received at the time. And so, the support from government financially and in terms of advice, needs to support them to make that move. But yeah, from a biodiversity point of view, absolutely, yes. I will hand over to others though, because I'm very aware of time, but yeah.
Well, thanks, Steph. Yeah, we've got quite an interesting group to discuss that here, because we have contract farmer who farms a few different farms, which is Martin, Callum and Tom, both managing on the larger scale of farms. And certainly a few years ago would have been large, but perhaps maybe you're on the smaller end now. And then at Hope Farm, we're 180 hectares, so what is probably a smaller farm if it's in hand, but then we are on a contract farming agreement where we kind of have, but it's also worth pointing there that we do have some really big fields to fit with the big farm machinery, but we work around that by having those infield strips and infield habitats to make sure we've got that diversity and connectivity. Martin is off mute, so I will kick over to him first.
Great, thank you. I just think it's about diversity of landscape. It's not really about the farm business side. It's about that diversity of cropping, habitat delivery. We've seen at Hope Farm and other farms where you have really big fields, you can put options in the field so you can reduce the actual lump of crop that's grown. And really the part of the question was about how to connect people with their food in the landscape. I mean, I'm a great supporter of Fair to Nature. It's a labelling system which championed 10% biodiversity delivery. And it's how we can connect the public to support the produce coming from landscape that's delivering for biodiversity and that diversity. And on our farm, we're welcoming back livestock. We've got sheep coming back, and I'm looking at bringing other livestock back in. So we can do diversity within the farming structure we have. We just need that diversity.
Well, thanks, Martin. And then if we just have a final comment from Tom and then Callum, would be great, please.
I would echo a lot of that, but I'd say, big farmers can be environmentally friendly too. Some of our biggest members of the Ely Nature Friendly Farming Zone are one of the biggest farmers in the area. I think the problem is with monoculture, and you've seen a lot of the way the fields and farms look today is a function of the machinery that has been used to do the farming. So the fields fit the machinery rather than the crop. And actually a lot of the crops might grow better with more diverse mix of crops in field. But I mean, the fenland rotation is one of the most diverse in the whole country. We have vegetable crops, root crops, cereal crops, oilseed crops. And like Martin, I'm bringing back sheep into the rotation as well over winter, cover crops as well. So the diversity of plants, isn't it? It's really what you're getting at is the monoculture. And I think you'll see farmers using farming techniques which work and which make sense. And if it makes sense, if it's possible to farm with smaller, more diverse fields, that's what they'll do. And I think you have to see a move away from big machinery on farms into some things like the small robot company is looking at, which you can actually do per plant farming. So I think there is a future there, which isn't necessarily smaller, more hobbyish type farms. I think you need prosperous farms to be able to invest in new ways of farming that break the mold.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. Over to you, Callum.
Yeah, I think I would say, firstly, I echo what Tom says, that bigger isn't always bad. I think that's really important to recognise. But I think, do I think small farms have a role to play? I hope so, because I'd like to farm in my own right at some point, and I don't think I'll be able to afford a big one. I think some of that will be linked to policy, and I think some of that will be linked to my own initiative and how I can connect people with the food I produce on the farm. And that's where I don't think you have to be organic to do that. But a link to a question earlier, I think organic farming allows you to shorten that supply chain, get more value out of that supply chain, and mean that you can sort of farm on a smaller scale. So yeah, I hope that helps.
No, that's brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Callum. And I think that has, it has really touched on how important it is on connecting the food and where it's come from, where it's grown, to nature. The bigger certainly doesn't always mean bad, but we have in farming such a diversity, a huge diversity of businesses, landscapes, and it is really important that policies in the future do support that, which is no mean feat at all. That has to be our final question, I'm afraid, but thank you very much for everybody who joined us. Just some final comments from me, that it was great to have an insight into all of these farms from the policy angle from Steph, and thank you, Sophie, for getting those questions to us, and to Becca for helping behind the scenes. Thank you so much to everyone who has asked the questions, and those that haven't been answered, don't worry, they will be, and they will be sent out in an email to all participants in a Word document. Do keep an eye out if you have, if you would like to be, or like to re-listen to this on the Farm Wildlife YouTube, and keep an eye out for our final webinar of the series, which is looking at future funding. Thanks very much, and good night.